to, notice how the pieces are moving. Oh, recording, sure. Uh, yeah, so that's one kind of learning where you can just rapidly infer a certain rule about how a piece of the game works just from a few examples given in context. Another kind is, if you want to actually get good at chess and be able to evaluate a complex board position. I don't even know how complex this board position is. I'm not like a great chess player, but it seems complicated to me. And so that kind of expertise you could think might involve, many, many, many games over the course of, training sessions, basically, in order to sort of develop the kind of subtle, nuanced sense of how to evaluate a position like this. So in the first case, it's flexible and is capable of generalizing rapidly. It only takes a few times to witness how a piece moves in order to generalize rapidly. Um, and the second works even in the absence of easily identifiable rules. So even if you can't put your finger on exactly which parts of this position are making you think that it's, there might be subtleties that are hard to articulate, basically. They're not easily, succinctly characterizable rules that tell you why this position is good or bad for black, for example. But even still, you can learn that sort of thing in this incremental trial and error sort of way. And these two types of learning interact. So if you have a rapid in type of inference, you might not need to develop painstakingly develop an intuition. So if there was some simple rule that you could use to evaluate the position in some cases, and you inferred that, you would now no longer need to develop the intuition over trial and error. So hopefully those sorts of dynamics make sense, and there is plenty of evidence for the presence of these two different kinds of learning, a distinction in human learning, like the one I just described. Uh, so there's a mountain of evidence. I'll just highlight a couple things, the ones that we basically focused on in our modeling efforts. So the first is a difference in curriculum effects, or you can call it curriculum effects, where in a task like this, where humans are required to learn certain categories, for example, to categorize line segments that vary in length and orientation. So in this example, the A category is just the shorter ones, and the B category is the longer ones, so it doesn't actually depend at all on orientation. So that makes it rule-like in this case. In this kind of category learning problem, human participants perform better when trials are blocked over time. So when you see a bunch of A examples before seeing a bunch of B examples, than they do when those trials are randomly shuffled or interleaved. So here's the data about that. This is from an older study, 2016. So we can call this a blocking advantage when the task is rule-like. On the other hand, when the task is rotated, or people also call this an information integration condition, because the two dimensions have to be integrated. In this case, there's no succinct rule because, basically to know whether the line is in the A category, you need to know something about both the length and the orientation. And so it's sort of hard to characterize verbally. And so in the cases like that, humans actually perform better when trials are randomly interleaved compared to blocked. So we can call that an interleaving advantage when the task is rotated or in the absence of rule-like structure. Another piece of evidence comes from Chris Summerfield's lab in another more recent paper. So in this task, humans were required to learn the XY coordinates of particular cues. And so they had to basically, upon seeing a cue, they had to drag a pirate to a specific XY coordinate. And so unknown to the participants at first, the uh, the sort of target location where you had to drag the pirate depended systematically on the cue, in the sense that the color always determined the X coordinate, for example, and the animal determined the Y coordinate, or vice versa. And so basically, it was possible over time for participants to, upon exposure to many cues, learn this sort of underlying rule that the color determines the x coordinate, the animal determines the y coordinate. And this was possible even though they were only given a few cues as studying examples, like during training. So I'll just focus on a couple of the conditions. In one of the conditions, participants only saw 9 of the cues, these 9, for example. So they saw one whole column and one whole row. So that's like all of the birds in all different colors, and then all of the green animals, basically. Um, and when the trials were blocked over time, so that, oh, I guess I didn't actually spell it out, but basically when they were given the whole column before the whole row, or vice versa, so they saw all the green animals in a row before all of the different colored birds, they did better than when these same nine were randomly shuffled or interleaved. And it sort of is intuitive if you think about it, because if you see that only the y coordinate in the target is changing as you change the animal, but not the color, then you might infer the fact that, oh, the color is not relevant to the y coordinate, it only depends on the animal, right? Okay, so this is a kind of compositionality, because this performance here is actually measuring performance on the held out 16 examples. So the ability of the participants to generalize, even though they've only been given these 9 examples to study from, the remaining 16 examples. And it requires a kind of compositionality, just in the sense that, generalization to the blue alligator, for example, requires composition of the knowledge that blue means that the x coordinate is 3, and the knowledge that the alligator means that the y coordinate is 2. So it's a sort of primitive form of compositionality that can be used to generalize outside of the training distribution. And likewise, they didn't actually do this condition, but we invented it just for basically symmetry with the other task. So when you rotate this task, you again sort of destroy, or at least make it, harder to verbalize what the rule is. In this case, it's still a simple rule, but it's sort of a rotated rule, so it's harder to succinctly verbalize. And in this case, as you move along the color dimension without changing the animal, both the x and the y coordinates change, right? So it's not like a one-to-one mapping. The color determines x, animal determines y. They're both involved in both x and y. So hopefully those make sense. So this is all just pointing to evidence that humans have 2 kinds of learning, because you can interpret this evidence in that framework. So let's see, do I have a slide here? Yeah, so the dual process account of human learning can explain that kind of evidence, because basically by positing 2 different learning systems, a rule-based learning system, which is operative when there are succinct rules governing the environment, and the rule-based system is, works rapidly by rapid inference, involves working memory, can be compositional perhaps, whereas the procedural learning system, which operates by default in the absence of rule-like structure, is going to be slow and incremental. And so the rule-based system, if it, because of its reliance on working memory, for example, performs better when trials are blocked over time, then that would explain the fact that humans, if their rule-based system is operative on the rule-like task, show the blocking advantage, whereas if the procedural learning system shows the opposite effect, an interleaving advantage, then if it's operative in the absence of rule-like structure, then that would explain why humans show the interleaving advantage on the rotated versions of the task, basically. So by positing 2 different systems here, it's possible to explain the sort of seemingly contradictory findings that humans do better with blocked trials in one case and better with interleaved trials in the other case, because one of the systems does better with blocked trials, and that one's operative in one case. The other one does better with interleaved trials, and that's operative in the other case. So that's one type of explanation. And if you think about this from a neural network perspective, uh, the procedural learning system it's very natural to model a procedural learning system with neural networks. They're already slow and incremental. They learn by updating their weights. slowly and incrementally. They don't generally have this sort of character of making rapid inferences with working memory or anything like that. So it's naturally slow and incremental, and they also naturally show an interleaving advantage for those of you who are familiar with catastrophic forgetting. When you take a neural network and you train it in a blocked manner, it generally is not a good idea because it will forget what it learned in the first block during the training of the second block. And so that makes it better. It's always better from a neural network perspective to train the weights in an interleaved way. Um, so uh, it's sort of a mystery how we can explain these sorts of phenomena, rapid inferences, working memory-based inferences, and a blocking advantage with a neural network framework. And so that's where these ideas from AI and large language models come in. So this is, at this point, a well-known distinction between in-context and in-weight learning. But a few years ago, it was just a new term um, in order to make a sort of critical distinction between the kinds of learning that large language models are capable of doing. So I'll just start from the beginning, if anyone's unfamiliar with this. So again, the typical form of learning in neural networks is in-weight learning. This is where, for example, I present a green giraffe. The neural network makes a guess at its XY coordinates, and if it gets it wrong, then it will backpropagate the error to update the weights so that on the next time seeing the green giraffe, it'll be more likely to get the right answer right. But the large language models now showed that a qualitatively different kind of learning is also possible in neural networks, and there have been previous neural networks that had showed this as well. But basically with the rise of large language models, this was termed in context learning, where you can freeze the weights basically and just present to the network some examples of the task you want it to perform. So after training on a big corpus of text, you can say, oh, okay, the green alligator is located at 2,2, the purple bird is at 2,3, so on and so forth, and then ask where the purple alligator is, and then it can learn the task just from these few examples given in context without updating the weights. So we can call these the study examples. Again, this can happen even when the weights are frozen, so it's a qualitatively different thing than in-weight learning. It doesn't require updates to the weights. It has to be happening somehow through the activation dynamics of the network. So somehow on the way from the inputs to the outputs, the model is learning from these examples that are given in context in order to generalize to this new example, the purple alligator that it hasn't seen before. And so it turns out that large language models are very good surprisingly good at this. It's like an emergent kind of learning that isn't explicitly trained in next token prediction, but somehow emerges over the course of doing enough next token prediction. And I also just want to point out here at the start that there's a natural trade-off here, similar to the one that I pointed to on the first slide, where basically you can imagine that during large language model pre-training, this ability to learn in context will develop at some point. And at that moment that it develops, the better the model is at performing in context learning, like performing these kinds of inferences in context, the fewer the errors it will make, the better it will be able to predict certain kinds of next tokens in certain cases, and therefore the less in-weight learning will happen on those specific trials. So there's this natural trade-off where, like, if you were given a sequence like this and you were good at in-context learning, then you get very little loss here at the end. But if you weren't good, then you would get a lot of loss, and you'd be sort of memorizing how what the answer to the purple alligator is. So hopefully that basic dynamic makes sense. That will be important for my results later. I also have this aside here. I guess I can probably skip this. This is just relating this in context learning idea to the meta reinforcement learning from a long time ago. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this paper from 2018, but yeah, if there's questions about that, I can go through this, but I'll just skip it for now. So I'm not sure how much time we'll have. So yeah, basically our hypothesis, to bring it all together now, is that this distinction between in-context and in-weight learning can help to see how it's possible for a neural network to at the same time simultaneously exhibit these in context learning phenomena, like these sort of rule-based learning phenomena, rapid inferences, working memory, perhaps a blocking advantage, while also exhibiting its sort of more natural learning phenomena, learning in a slow way, an incremental way, and exhibiting an interleaving advantage on two different tasks. So we hypothesized that the distinction between in context and in-way learning can help to explain how one neural network, a single neural network, could reproduce all these findings that I showed before simultaneously, with in-context learning being responsible for the sort of rapid compositional working memory mediated inference, and also a blocking advantage on rule-like tasks, whereas the usual typical in-weight learning can be responsible for those other phenomena I described before. It learns slowly and incrementally by default, and it shows an interleaving advantage due to the phenomenon of catastrophic forgetting. And that would be specifically on rotated tasks. So to test this hypothesis, we took some neural networks. We also tested large language models, but also start with the meta-learning neural networks. So we took neural networks and we trained them to learn how to learn in context. And we did this with a very simple setup. So we basically took the same task and generalized it so that we can make a distribution of tasks to train the network on. So our particular distribution, it looked like this. We would just sample 5 colors, sample 5 animals, randomly permute them so that we assigned, one color to one X coordinate, one animal to one Y coordinate, and so forth. So we have a bunch of different possible grids that the network might have to learn. We give 9 examples, just like the humans saw, in context, along with their XY coordinates. And then we train the model to predict the corresponding XY coordinates of a query animal with those things given in context, basically. So, and then we test on held out tasks that we didn't train on. So we can just hold out some of these, basically permutations of the grid here. And then during testing, we can, if in context learning has emerged, then the network will be capable of solving a given task in context without updating the weights. But we can also allow in-weight learning to happen so that if it didn't learn very well how to learn in context, or it just fails on this particular task for some reason, then we can allow the network to adjust its weights in order to compensate for that failure of in-context learning in the usual way by backpropagating and updating the weights so that it's more likely to get the query correct. So that's the basic setup for what we did in our experiments. So everything I'll show you from now on will be after meta-learning, and will be basically in this regime where we allow in-context and in-weight learning to happen simultaneously. So here are the basic results. Oh, is there any chat here? Expert system. Okay, so there's a question in the chat. It says, can I consider the ICL as a modern version of expert system? Yeah, if you're thinking like about a rule-based expert system, like, good old-fashioned AI, I think that, it's not exactly the same as that because, we're not hand coding what the rules are per se. That's how the expert systems were built back in the day, is that you get experts to actually just try to hand code all the rules about how to solve a given domain. And so it's not like that in this case, but perhaps what emerges from the neural network can be considered more rule-based than the usual kind of incremental sort of in-weight learning can be. But the way in which the in-context learning algorithm behaves will itself be meta-learned from data. So yeah, again, it doesn't require this sort of hand coding, and that can be a good thing or a bad thing, I guess, depending on your perspective. But yeah, we can discuss that more in a bit. So here are the main, yeah. So here are the main results, or one set of them anyway. So here's the this task. Again, the goal is to select the XY coordinates corresponding to a particular Q. We have the rule-like version of the task where it's sort of aligned with the color and the shape of the Q, or the animal of the Q. And then the rotated version where the color and shape and animal do not correspond one-to-one to the X and Y coordinates. So in this case, after meta-learning, we can just test in the few-shot setting. So before we do any in-weight learning, and we can see that the model did better when trials were blocked compared to interleaved, and they did better on the rule-like version of the task. So these are both basically what we wanted from the hypothesis that we had originally. So it's showing good compositional generalization. Again, this is accuracy on the held out 16 examples that weren't trained. So it's getting basically perfect accuracy, at least when the in-context examples are blocked compared to interleaved. And again, it shows this blocking advantage on the rule-like task, where it does better on the blocked version than the interleaved version. And it does poorly on the rotated version of the task. I can go into why that is in a second. I didn't mention this before, but basically during meta-learning, we train on this version, so the rule-like version of the task, and the version where the trials are blocked rather than interleaved. And that's because basically the hypothesis is that during development, humans, when they're learning how to solve new problems in context with their working memory and inference, they will learn more often in cases where information is basically organized over time and it's not just haphazard and random, like in formal education, for example. And also, if it's just not really possible to learn in the rotated version in context, that's one idea. But for us, we're just basically assuming that it's arbitrary whether you consider the colors as the X coordinate, the animals as the Y coordinate, or if you consider the latent X coordinate being some combination of color and animal. That's arbitrary from a neural network's perspective. And so we basically assume that the structure of the world is such that it's more likely to observe cases where a given task requires, for example, just focusing on color or just focusing on animals than it requires to focus on both at the same time. So that's the sort of assumption behind the meta-learning procedure. And then sort of unsurprisingly, when you meta-learn, when trials are rule-like and blocked, the network generalizes better to new tasks that are rule-like and blocked, basically. So that's why you get this really poor performance on these rotated tasks without having seen a rotated task before, basically. And so, but the key thing that we want to focus on is that sort of regardless of whether that assumption holds true in the real world, our key thing is that this meta-learning allows you to basically distinguish two different kinds of learning, because in the in-context phase, you can be showing a blocking advantage, while at the same exact time on the task, whatever task you do fail at, if in-weight learning is allowed to happen after that, those errors that you made can be backpropagated to update the weights. And so in this case, on the rotated task, the model's failing. And that means that in-weight learning will basically take over. And so in-weight learning will sort of be the dominant form of learning on the rotated task. And that's why you can see the opposite pattern. So here the model on the rotated task showed an interleaving advantage. And this was exactly because of what I mentioned before, this catastrophic forgetting phenomenon. So this is like a classic sort of picture of what catastrophic forgetting looks like. It learns, here I'm splitting accuracy on the task that was learned in the first block versus the second block is in orange. And so you can see that it learns the first block fine. And then as it learns during the second block, the orange trials, it forgets what it had learned in the purple task, basically, or the purple block. And so, yeah, this is basically classic catastrophic forgetting, and it explains how the network can exhibit an interleaving advantage on the rotated version of the task. And then I also want to point out that the test accuracy is quite low here regardless. And so this here is test accuracy. So this compositional generalization ability. And so even when the network performs well on the interleaved case, when it's learning in weights, it still doesn't generalize compositionally. And that's because of this. Basically, in weights learning is not very good at generalizing out of distribution, outside of its training distribution, whereas in context learning can be in some cases. Okay, there are some questions here. It says, what model is used in this experiment? Oh, like architecture, I used all transformers. Um, yeah, we considered doing some RNN type stuff, but we basically used all transformers to meta learn and then yeah, evaluated them in this with this sort of strange procedure where we allowed them to learn in context and in weights. And we use transformers just because um, basically transformers have been shown to be just better at learning how to in context learn. RNNs have in some cases been shown to develop in context learning abilities, but it's just much harder to get them um, to develop those abilities. And I have some ideas about why that is. I think it's sort of clear why that is intuitively, but we can talk about that if anyone's interested. And the other question is, in-weight learning is not meta-trained. Yes, exactly. So there is no meta training for in-weight learning. It's just the in-context learning that's meta trained in this case. Like in-weight learning is just a default sort of way that a neural network can learn. There are in-weight kinds of meta learning. So like from, if anyone has heard of MAML, model agnostic meta learning, that algorithm is basically allows meta learning to happen in weights as well. Um, so I can go into that if someone's interested about that. But yeah, our basic assumption is that, the synaptic plasticity rules in the brain are similar to the ones encoded in neural networks, where they're just basically hard coded. In these artificial neural networks, it does backpropagation, the gradient descent, the usual stuff. And that algorithm is not itself learned from data. That's just hard coded about the neural networks. And so we assume that that's also true to some extent in the brain. It's possible that there's some meta learning in weights in the brain. That could be interesting. But that's not our assumption. But our assumption is also that in context learning, this sort of working memory activation mediated kind of inference is itself meta learned. And I think that that idea does have some merit in terms of psychological plausibility and biological plausibility as well. Hopefully that clarifies. Okay, yeah, if there's no other questions, I can just move on. So just to summarize what happened here, we we basically confirmed our hypotheses that, or intuitions that this distinction between in-context and in-weight learning could explain those results that I presented before. So we found that under some certain circumstances, a single neural network can exhibit compositionality and a blocking advantage on rule-like tasks via in-context learning, while the same network can simultaneously exhibit an interleaving advantage on the rotated versions of the task, and that is due to this phenomenon of catastrophic forgetting, which happens naturally whenever a neural network is learning in its weights. Oh, yeah, so I guess I had this here as well. So this is just the other version of the task, the category learning task, where again, the participants had to categorize whether a given line segment was an A line or a B line. We have two different structures. One is rule-like, where the categories only depend on the length or the orientation. And then the rotated structure, where the the category depends on both the length and the orientation, and it's hard to sort of succinctly verbalize what the rule is. And we see basically the same effects where here there's no out of distribution generalization. We didn't test that. There's no sort of compositionality analog, but we show that the blocking advantage emerges in the few shot setting on the rule-like task. And then the interleaving advantage emerges on the rotated task due to, again, this catastrophic forgetting where the neural network will forget in the blocked setting what happened in the previous blocks, whereas that won't happen in the interleave setting. So it's basically an analogous set of results minus the compositional generalization test on this sort of entirely different task, where again humans showed this interaction where they did better on in the blocked condition on the rule-like task, but better in the interleave condition on the rotated task. And so, as I mentioned, we did also test the LLMs. These are old LLMs at this point. We tested Llama 2. And so the reason for doing this is that, as I mentioned, the meta-learned neural networks were basically trained on very related tasks. So our meta-learning neural networks, not only were they trained on tasks that were already sort of very similar, like it was just a distribution of like that color animal grid task, just with different coordinates for different colors and animals. But also we specifically sort of assumed that the training data was blocked and rule-like, right? So we assume that the world in which the network is developing is more often blocked than it is randomly shuffled, and is more often rule-like in the sense that, like, colors, tasks depend only on one or the other dimension than they do on both. And so those are sort of developmental assumptions that we made, which are not present in large language models. So large language models are trained just on a big corpus of text, right? Just to predict the next token. These are both non-instruction tuned or RLHF models. So this is just the pre-trained models. And after next token prediction. And so in both cases, we showed these same phenomena emerge. So both models perform better on the rule-like versions of the task than the rotated version. So, and also on the blocked version of the task than on the interleaved version of the task. And so this, to us, was some hint, some suggestion that maybe the world, like the natural world, the actual world, could have these data distributional properties where, it's more likely for the large language model to experience, rule-like settings where the examples given in context are sort of given in a blocked, structured way rather than randomly interleaved. And also something analogous to this rule-like setting where, more often than not, the tasks that the large language model encounters in the wild during pre-training have a sort of rule-like structure. And maybe that's due to the structure of language specifically. Yeah, it's not exactly clear if this would generalize to other kinds of non-language pre-trained neural networks, but yeah, we took this as basically some evidence that those assumptions that we made for our meta-learning neural networks also hold with a certain kind of naturalistic data set, which is these large corpora of that the large language models are pre-trained on. And of course, there's a lot that's not psychologically or biologically plausible about the training process of large language models, but it does at least have this naturalistic quality where we didn't sort of hand construct the nature of the data set, with specific goals in mind, basically. Yeah, so hopefully that makes sense. Oh, I also have an aside here about it could be mysterious, I think, when you first learn about in-context learning and why it emerges in large language models. Um, and that's just because, if you're just training to do next token prediction, the question is like, why does that mean that you should be able to, um, you know, learn new tasks on the fly just from a few examples? Like, it's sort of hard to see how those things could be related from each other. And this relates to, all of the other emergent capabilities that large language models have shown. And I think one way of understanding why those emergent capabilities develop in these models is to consider language modeling as a kind of meta-learning. This is not my idea. In particular, in the original GPT-3 paper, they basically hinted at this, and a lot of others have explicitly thought about this. But so if we imagine that this is our big pre-training distribution that the large language models are trained on, so each of these points is like a particular next token prediction, basically. Uh, we could think about this big distribution as a distribution of tasks that the network is meta learning on. So it's learning how to solve many different kinds of tasks, um, where, for example, one task could be, basically derive the indirect object from a sentence. Another task could be convert a verb to the past tense. Another task could be a programming type of task. And then there might even be some samples in the pre-training corpus that look like this, where the model has to learn in context to compose bits of knowledge that it's just acquiring in this context. So I made up this Harry Potter example. I'm a millennial, so I read Harry Potter as a kid. So Hermione exclaimed Accio Quill. So there's basically two different, magic words that maybe the model's never seen before, and it needs to compose them in order to predict what the next two tokens will be at the end of the sentence here. That's the point of this example. And so if there's enough examples like this in the pre-training corpus, that should mean that there's pressure on the model to develop the ability to rapidly acquire concepts in context and use them to predict the next token. That's the point of this slide, basically. So it's sort of trying to demystify why in-context learning can emerge, and even a compositional kind of in-context learning could emerge in large language models. One answer is maybe that we can think of large language modeling as a kind of meta-learning. Okay, sorry for that long spiel. I guess it's not 52. So yeah, just to wrap up here, in context learning, in-weight learning can have different advantages. Um, Basically, in context learning, you can make rapid inferences, generalize better. In weight learning, can learn even in the absence of rule-like structure. So whenever in context learning fails, you can pick up the slack within weight learning. But something I didn't mention was that it also has better retention in the absence of contextual information. So if you remove those in-context examples, obviously the network will not remember anything about what happened because it didn't learn anything in its weights, right? So that's a problem with in-context learning. And humans show a similar trade-off. So if you give humans a working memory task like this, where they have to learn to map stimuli to specific actions, then they do better. They can learn faster when the set size is small. Hopefully that makes sense. If you're just learning one thing over and over again, it's pretty easy. You can like do very well, very fast. If there's a bunch of things you're trying to learn, then it takes you longer. And so we can think about this as working memory load. Under high working memory load, it takes you longer to learn, basically. And in this setting, humans also show neural signatures of this working memory load, neural signatures of the errors. So if you measure the extent to which uh, reward prediction errors can be sort of quantified from an EEG signal, this is like the work of Ann Collins and Michael, my advisor, then you can see that in the high set size case, when there's a lot of stuff you're trying to learn, those errors are larger. Those neural signatures of errors are larger. And basically, this is the key finding that after a delay, if you had learned under a high set size, paradoxically, you actually show better retention of this stuff that you learned. Whereas if you only saw one thing and you learned in that setting, then after a delay, you'll just forget it because basically the whole time you were just, relying on your working memory and pressing the same button over and over again, basically. So hopefully this makes sense. So we reproduced these same findings. I can go into the details of what we did if you want. But yeah, we basically showed that this same dynamic between in-context and in-weight learning reproduces these same findings here. So better, like faster learning when working memory is not loaded, whereas slower learning when working memory is loaded. And then in that case, there's more neural signatures of errors and then higher retention in the end. And that's because more in-weight learning happens when there's more errors. And in weights, if you've encoded something in your weights, then you'll retain it later. Whereas if you just, fleetingly encode something in context to get the right answer, then you actually do quite poor after a delay if that answer is not given in context. Yeah, so hopefully that makes sense. And I'll just conclude so we have some time for questions. There's 5 minutes here. Yeah, hopefully convinced you that there's these important trade-offs between in-context and in-weight learning in neural networks and in today's AI systems, and that this distinction has something to do with the distinction between two kinds of learning that can happen in humans as well. With in-context learning, explaining how a neural network and perhaps the human brain can be capable of rapid, flexible, and compositional generalization, and be capable of exhibiting a blocking advantage, whereas in-weight learning can explain how humans can learn incrementally with good retention and exhibit an interleaving advantage on tasks that are sort of not rule-like. So thanks for your attention. I can take questions with 4 minutes left.
Yes, if you have any questions, please directly open the mic to ask Jake.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Jake. Oh, that's great talk. I'm totally convinced. I just feel like in this particular example, it seems like the compositionality can be resolved by learning about sub-goals. So basically, once you understand the goal structure, it's like there are two goals, learning about the color and learning about the object, and it's resolved. And just curious how you think in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a key point. And I definitely agree with you that it seems like this should be possible even without anything fancy like meta learning. In our case, just the way that we encoded the stimuli meant that it was not possible because each stimulus is basically an arbitrary token. And so the neural network doesn't in advance know that, like, that this color, yeah, basically because it's arbitrary, there is no way for like a naive neural network to generalize. But if for example, you just encoded with floats or whatever, if you had a sort of linear encoding, then a neural network should generalize automatically, even if it hasn't seen examples in some part of the space. So I agree with you on that point, and I think that is a key point, whether you can do it linearly. And actually, recently, I've been thinking about how chain of thought is important in large language models for cases specifically that you can't generalize linearly, basically that aren't where the representations don't aren't encoded linearly, the relationships. So yeah, I think that's an interesting direction, but that's a good point. Yeah, thanks for that point.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, yeah, it's good.
Hello? Hello?
Yeah.
Thanks, Jake. I think your talk just remind me of one paper done by Yong Liu and others in 2023. I can send you the archive link in the chat. Well, basically, this work just showed us from a mathematical perspective that transformers in context learning process is mathematically equivalent to a single gradient descent step on a contractive learning task. I don't know if this result can improve our understanding of your result.
Yes, I have seen that paper. Wait, I cannot copy it. Am I just having a boomer moment right now? I'll look at it later. So yeah, the gradient descent, it's basically something like in context learning does gradient descent or something, where they train with regression. Is that right? Linear regression problems?
I don't really remember the experiment, but I
Okay.
remember the theoretical part. They just proved that the ICL process is some kind of equivalent to the single gradient descent step in contractive learning task. So I think there is some sort of unified framework between ICL and IWL.
Yeah, that is an interesting perspective. I think there were a few different papers that I was reading that basically have different ways of understanding the in-context learning algorithm. So one of them is in-context learning as gradient descent. Another one is in-context learning as Bayesian inference. There's papers about that as well, if you're interested. And then also, so yeah, I mean, I think that both are basically valid. Like, it's also sort of hard to see how it wouldn't be true that like all learning is gradient descent in some sense, right? On some gradient. That was sort of my take on that paper, um, but yeah, it's still, I would say, possible to think in this case with my tasks of the in-context learning process as doing a kind of in-context learning. I would be curious, sorry, as doing a kind of a gradient descent. I would be curious to try the same analyses, like, because this task, because of it, it's so specific, like, you might, like, so for example, if you just see a few examples, even just, I guess, two or something, if you just see like this example here, so the red bird is at 1, 1, and then maybe the blue alligator is at 2, or 3, 2, and then you try maybe the red alligator. In principle, the model should be able to do that if it's meta-learned. And so that to me doesn't strike me as something that's gradient descent like, because it's really one shot, like it's an inference. I don't know, that just seems to me like something more like inference that's not exactly incremental. And so I think even if in some cases you can get in context learning to look like gradient descent, I think it will depend on the task, what the extent to which it does look like gradient descent in the end. Because, yeah, some tasks, if you've meta-learned them correctly, it should basically be like if you know one thing, if you know X, Y, Z, then you get the answer basically. And it's not really like, oh, well, I know X, so I slightly adjust my prediction. And then I know Y, and I slightly adjust my prediction. It's basically like if there's X and there's Y, now I know the answer. So, yeah, hopefully that is an alternative perspective on the idea.
Yeah, I see. Thank you so much. And
Yeah.
I have one more question.
Sure.
Can I understand? Can I say that the rule-like and rotated case is something like generalize and memorize?
Yeah. Yeah, I would say so. So in this task, definitely when the network is learning this rotated version, it's basically memorizing the answers. Like you can see how badly it does on the test set here. And so yeah, I think that in this case, this rotated learning is basically pure memorization. In weight learning doesn't always have to be pure memorization, but yeah, I think that is a good way of thinking about it, at least in this case.
Yeah, I mean, and you use supervised learning in the fine-tuning
Yes.
state, right?
Yeah.
And it reminded me of one paper that give us a result that SFT memorize and RL generalize.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know if there is any further work on using reinforcement learning to do this kind of task.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I mean, the original MindRL paper from DeepMind had a similar ideas going on, but I don't know if they actually allowed in-weight learning to happen after it had already developed the ability through meta learning to learn in context. So I think taking these ideas and testing them out in a reinforcement learning setting would be super interesting. Like to test these same, because the same dynamics should hold in the reinforcement learning setting. Like if you have an RNN, for example, or a transformer that's doing the RL process, it should be able to make inferences in context, you know, if it's been meta learned. And those inferences, to the extent that it can learn those inferences well, that might still have the same like dynamic where it means that you don't have to, that sort of interferes with the direct memorization in weights for a particular policy in a particular scenario or something. You know what I mean? So I don't know. It would be interesting to look at this in the RL setting for sure.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Cool. Yeah, I actually have to go to another meeting, but thank you for having me. And if you have further questions, you can definitely shoot me an email. I don't know if my email is available on the website or whatever, but
Yeah,
yeah, it's on my
it will,
website.
it will. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I will share the link. Yeah. Thank you,
Awesome.
Jake,
Yeah.
for coming today. Yeah.
Thanks. All right.
Yeah.
See you guys
Thank
later.
you
Thank you,
so
everyone.
much.
See you.
Bye bye.